Did you pass your 11 plus exam?
Yes, I did.
60 years on from this, secondary school selection is to be expanded. Mrs May's social justice in action? Good evening. Selective education is on its way back. It's official, according to Education Secretary Justine Greening. Tonight we ask, can you progress social mobility by going backwards? In America, if Trump and Hillary fail, the third candidate is this man.
What would you do if you were elected about Aleppo?
About?
Aleppo.
And what is Aleppo?
You're kidding.
No.
Done for sex and race discrimination 2 years ago, now a report reveals a culture of fear amongst minority officers in London Police. And MPs and peers are told to vacate disintegrating Westminster to enable repairs. The former Deputy Prime Minister says the rotting building mirrors the state of the politics inside it.
Constitutionally, institutionally and physically, Westminster is just not fit for purpose.
So can grammar schools really improve social mobility in England? That's clearly the Prime Minister's view, backed today by the Education Secretary. But Justine Greening's told MPs that there would be no return to the days of simplistic division between 11-year-old children into winners and losers. Our Home Affairs correspondent Darshna Soni has been to one grammar school in Birmingham.
Back at school, the girls of King Edward Camp Hill in Kings Heath. They all had to pass the 11 plus to get into this oversubscribed grammar. As the new term begins, they're well aware that the language of selection has been dominating the headlines. After days of speculation, Justine Greening was called to respond to an urgent question in the Commons.
There'll be no return to the simplistic binary choice of the past where schools separate children into winners and losers, successes or failures. This government wants to focus on the future.
Such is the emotive nature of the debate. The Education Secretary, the first ever to have attended a comprehensive, managed to avoid saying the words grammar school at all in her statement.
The Birmingham Central Grammar School first assembled in 1897.
For critics, grammars are education policy by nostalgia, a hankering for an era of rising living standards and higher ambitions.
And I think it's wrong at the age of 11 for a child to be designated as one of the lucky winners in society, while somebody who doesn't pass the exam is written off basically as a loser.
You're all right, don't run.
But is it possible to create inclusive grammars when the very objective of selective education is to separate children by ability? Nationally, only 3% of pupils in grammar schools are on free school meals, and critics say that's the problem. But here, that figure is 20%, because in the last few years, this chain of grammar schools has made a huge effort to recruit pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds who wouldn't normally think of applying to a grammar. The King Edward VI Foundation runs 5 grammars across Birmingham and reserves 20% of places for students eligible for the pupil premium.
I think it was fashionable to have long skirts then.
Head teacher Linda Johnson says their intake has changed hugely over the years and that it's critics who have an outdated view. She argues today's pupils fairly reflect the ethnic and social mix of the local area.
What would you say to critics who say, you know, in some of the poorer areas, inner city areas of Birmingham, their children are suffering, they're just not, this kind of school just isn't on offer to them?
It absolutely is on offer, and I suppose that's the basis of the work that we've been doing, is trying to get into areas where we haven't routinely had children apply to the grammar schools, getting them to understand that they are accessible to their able pupils in those schools, that we want them to apply.
The head teacher argues that in theory anybody can sit the 11 plus, but acknowledges that some better off parents pay for private tutors to coach children through the tests. 10-year-old Rena is sitting her 11 plus this Saturday. Her parents have paid for 6 months of tutoring to help her prepare.
And do you mind if I ask you how much it's cost you, the tutoring?
Yeah, it doesn't mind at all. It's about £120, £130 a month.
What do you think about the argument that you're able to buy your way into passing the test, that it favours middle-class parents like yourself?
I don't think you're buying your way in personally. I think, yes, obviously there's an advantage, and if you can, you give your child whatever advantage you can in life. That's duty to parents, really.
Theresa May is expected to set out just how grammar schools can deliver her vision of a more equal society in the next few weeks. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Birmingham.
Our political editor Gary Gibbon is in Westminster. Gary, would a change in the law be required for this?
Well, this, I think Theresa May will probably emphasise, is a consultation, so we can't know exactly what comes out the other end. But yes, if she decides to increase the number of grammar schools in the country, the Department for Education has been through this with a fine-tooth comb. They're convinced that the 1998 law that Tony Blair brought in, which stopped selection, that would need to be changed. And at the moment, that only allows an existing grammar school to create an extension or annex, as it's been called. If you really want to go for grammar schools, then you do need a change in the law.
And what are the chances of the government getting such a measure through?
Well, it's not straightforward, as you can tell from the fact that they're cautiously wording the language around this, saying it wouldn't be back to the 50s and 60s. The Education Secretary not even keen to utter the word grammar school. Grammar school does have quite a lot of support amongst Conservative MPs, but grammar schools weren't enormously popular by the end of their period of dominance in British education. And I think you're going to find an awful lot of effort is going in to try and bring over support by mitigating some of the effects of dividing the goats and the sheep, that sort of thing, that were very prominent then, by saying that there won't be a grammar school necessarily in every town, so it won't completely dominate the education landscape, and by trying to make sure that it's more inclusive, perhaps, than the old model. But there will be division on this within the Conservative Party, and the majority isn't great, and a lot of the people who might be against it are the people that Theresa May liberated from office a short while ago when she came to power.
Gary Gibbon. Well, now, if Theresa May wants to improve social mobility and help those who are struggling to get by, as she said on first entering Downing Street, she could do worse than look at zero-hours contracts. The number of people working on such arrangements has jumped by more than 20% since this time last year to just over 900,000. The unions say the contracts leave the low-paid not knowing if they can cover the bills from week to week. Our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is here. So what's the central concern about these contracts?
Look, a lot of people would tell you that 0 hours simply reflects the flexibility not just demanded by companies, but also by workers. The problem is there's growing anecdotal evidence that 0 hours is being used as a tool for worker exploitation. And if we have a look at the numbers, you can see that it's shot up to over 900,000 people in the UK on these contracts. At this rate, we'll hit 1 million by the end of the year. And if you look at the time graph, go back to the year 2000, and you've only got 250,000 people on such contracts, and it stays static for more than a decade. Then all of a sudden you have the financial crisis. 0 hour contracts shoot up as unemployment grows as well, because at that point, any job is better than no job. The problem is unemployment has come down, but 0 hour contracts continue to grow.
And what do we know about the people on them?
Well, it's definitely concentrated in certain groups. For example, more than half are women. And then more than a third are the young, many in education. 25% work for the leisure industry.
And is anything going to be done about this?
It's very difficult. This week you saw Mike Ashley agree to switch his retail staff from 0 hours to fixed hours, but he didn't do the same for his warehouse staff, much to the annoyance of unions. They would like to see the whole thing legally banned. It's very hard to see how that will happen. This is no longer a response to a crisis. This is entrenched within the British labour market.
Helia Ebrahimi. Well, as the policies of the new government begin to come together, the building in which they work is falling apart. MPs and peers have been told they should plan to move out of Parliament for 6 years so that a multi-billion-pound refurbishment can be carried out. The Victorian Palace is suffering from crumbling stonework, leaking roofs, but a parliamentary report says the greatest problem is the decay of the vast network of water pipes and electrical cables that run through the building. The report says there is a growing risk of a catastrophic event, such as a major fire. Well, one man who's long tried to shake up the inside of the Palace of Westminster is Nick Clegg. He's written his memoirs on life inside the coalition government as Deputy Prime Minister and life on the political periphery after the Brexit vote. I met him earlier in Westminster, asked him what he made of the premiership of his erstwhile cabinet colleague, Theresa May.
Theresa May is a traditional Conservative. She is diligent. She is hardworking. She will need to learn. She will need to learn, which is a difficult thing. I don't think it has happened yet. But there's a huge difference between controlling one fiefdom in Whitehall and reacting to national and global events from one minute to the next, which happens if you're Prime Minister, or dare I say it, even Deputy Prime Minister. It's quite a different role. And at the moment, she's trying to impose a very similar, quite centralising, controlled modus operandi on her government that she did on the Home Office. That won't last. It won't last.
Your book doesn't get personal about anybody, really,
no.
Except there is a sort of whiff of pretty strong despair with Michael Gove.
To say it'd be probably one of the worst kept secrets in Westminster, to say that Michael Gove and I didn't exactly see eye to eye by the end of the government is an understatement. We just, and dare I say it, it was borne out in spades by his behaviour in the referendum. The point at which he compared people who defended the European Union with intellectual apologists of the Nazi regime, I'm afraid at that point I realised quite how inevitable it was that Michael Gove and I should not be inhabiting the same ideological space.
Is your kind of politics over?
I think the kind of politics I believe in, a moderate, liberal, reforming, internationalist, it's on the retreat not just in the United Kingdom, but across the developed world. The populists in Hungary, in Poland, in Austria, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, and of course in North America as well. And what we're actually living with is the politics of which was started, if you like, on the tremors, the after tremors of 2008. It's left millions and millions of people more socially insecure, but crucially not having received a pay rise for close to 8-9 years now, whilst they feel the elites, whether it's bankers or politicians or regulators, not apologising, not being held to account. That understandably leads to rage and a sense of grievance. What the populists then do is they say, you're angry, I feel your rage, it's the Mexicans' fault, it's Brussels' fault, it's London's fault, it's Islam's fault. And that finding someone to blame for complex problems is the single common ingredient of populism on the right and the left. And liberals, with perhaps some notable exceptions like Justin Trudeau in Canada, it's very difficult for the reasoned centre ground to hold its own in that environment.
One last thing, the committee sorting out the future of the parliamentary building, which is falling down, is today saying that there is going to have to be an evacuation in 4 years' time.
I didn't know that.
And what I do wonder is, could that be some kind of mechanism for reform?
I don't know whether vacating that building will necessarily be the catalyst for it. I tell you what, though, vacating that building is a very, very good metaphor for how rotten it's become. I mean, this place just is simply not fit for a 21st century democracy. So who knows, maybe if we meet in more
physically
21st...
or spiritually, intellectually, or what?
Constitutionally, institutionally, and physically, Westminster is just not fit for purpose. And the fact that the thing is rat-infested, asbestos-infested, and needs to be vacated for so long is, if anyone needs any further proof, the clear demonstration of the desperate need for us to renew our creaking and threadbare democracy.
Nick Clegg, thank you very much for talking to Syria now, and dozens of people left the besieged Damascus suburb of Moadamiyah today in what the Syrian government is calling an amnesty for those left in the rebel-held suburb. The neighbourhood has been under siege for more than 3 years, but a deal was finally reached with the Assad government last week. The agreement allows civilians to leave their homes but remain in regime-held areas, while fighters and activists were taken by bus to rebel districts in northern Syria. Well, Syria's been at the very heart of exchanges in the US presidential campaign over the last 24 hours, with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump taking part in a TV defense and foreign affairs forum. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris is in Florida tonight, a must-win state for both candidates. Kylie.
And John, it's very likely to be a tight race here, and people are still making up their minds, which is why these big set pieces, the forum last night, the debate in a few weeks, are so important. There were moments when Hillary Clinton at times felt defensive, even irritated by questions about the email scandal last night, but she was more resolute when it came to describing the limits to America's involvement in the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
We're going to work to make sure that they have the support. They have special forces, as you know, they have enablers, they have surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance help. They are not going to get ground troops. We are not putting ground troops into Iraq ever again, and we're not putting ground troops into Syria. We're going to defeat ISIS without committing American ground troops.
As for Donald Trump, he spoke with his usual kind of dramatic flair, but there was less policy detail. He was asked too about his plans to deal with the Islamic State, and he said he does have a plan, but it's secret.
I have a plan, but I don't want to, look, I have a very substantial chance of winning. Make America great again. We're going to make America great again. I have a substantial chance of winning. If I win, I don't want to broadcast to the enemy exactly what my plan is. And let me tell you, if I like maybe a combination of my plan and the general's plan, or the general's plan, if I like their plan, Matt, I'm not going to call you up and say, Matt, we have a great plan. This is what Obama does.
Now, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are not the only candidates in this race. Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate, was running a distant third. He'd been polling particularly well, but today he's had a terrible day. Listen to how he answered a question on breakfast television about his policy on Aleppo.
What would you do if you were elected about Aleppo?
About?
Aleppo.
And what is Aleppo?
You're kidding.
No.
Aleppo is in Syria. It's the epicenter of the refugee crisis.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
Of course, that really didn't look good, but I think it's a chilling warning, really, for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump as they prepare for this all-important first debate, that they need to be on point, that they need to know the answers, that they need to both look presidential. As for Gary Johnson, well, it's very hard at this stage in the race to recover from something like that.
Kylie Morris in Florida. And if you're still wondering what is Aleppo, well, do go to our website, channel4.com/news, and watch some of our exclusive reports from right inside the city. Here, officers and other staff of the country's biggest police force are expected to be victimized and have their careers damaged if they complain about discrimination. A 2-year inquiry into the Metropolitan Police has described the situation as unacceptable. Channel 4 News has learned that a new unit's being set up to handle complaints of discrimination, as our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel now reports.
The Carol Howard case raised serious concerns around the Metropolitan Police's treatment of female, black and Asian and gay officers. An employment tribunal found she was the victim of sex and race discrimination and ruled she'd been singled out because she'd complained. Her plight triggered a 2-year investigation by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And while it couldn't prove claims of unlawful victimisation, it did find there was a culture of fear.
There is a clear expectation amongst staff and officers that if you make a complaint of discrimination, you will be victimised.
You're talking about in the report about officers having an expectation of victimisation. Well, of course they do, because the people who actually do the victimisation are never held accountable and never disciplined. The 5 officers in Carol Howard's case, not a single one of those officers has actually faced a misconduct panel 2 years later.
He and his client are not the only ones unhappy with this report. The Met is too. The Commission's reference to the force's painful history around discrimination has rankled senior officers. Channel 4 News has learnt that a new discrimination investigations unit is being set up to deal with internal grievances.
If you're a manager or an individual out in the organisation who gets one of these quite difficult and complex cases, one of the challenges we've had in the past is these things get forced through the organisation, and by the time they arrive on a desk like mine or someone else, people have hardened up, taken positions.
In fact, the Commission found there was a general reluctance to admit mistakes or apologise. According to those representing minority officers, it means it's impossible to get an accurate picture of the scale of discrimination inside the largest force in the country.
People that want to complain about discrimination are suffering in silence. People will only come to make the complaint at the very last, nth degree, where, they're literally on the edge of a cliff, basically with the mental impact, with the stress of actually trying to deal with this.
I hope that my case will now forever be in history for assisting in change in the Metropolitan Police.
Carol Howard's days in uniform may be over, but her case still resonates. Within a few days, the Met, for the first time, will have more than 4,000 ethnic minority officers in its ranks. And so it's becoming more important than ever to ensure fair treatment at work.
Simon Israel. Now, her daughter was killed in a backpackers' hostel in Australia. Mir Elif Chung was allegedly stabbed to death by a man shouting Allah Akbar. But her mother, Rosie, is anxious that the death is not seen as an example of Islamist terrorism. Rosie Elif will be giving her first full-length interview on television since the tragedy in a moment. But first, a reminder of what happened. Mir had just begun a 3-month stint working on a farm in Queensland when she was brutally attacked at the hostel where she'd been staying. The man who's been charged with her murder is Frenchman Smail Ayad. He'd apparently met Mir just a few days before her death and had become infatuated with her. On the night of the attack, some witnesses described how Ayad shouted Allah Akbar during the stabbing. Others said he was shouting but was incoherent. The attacker also turned on another British backpacker, Tom Jackson, stabbing him up to 20 times as he tried to help Mir. He died a week later. Police investigating the double murder have said so far there is no sign Ayad had been radicalised, though there are questions about his mental state and whether he'd been smoking cannabis that night. Mir's family held a private, multi-faith funeral for her in Queensland last week. Ayad will appear in court charged with her murder next month. And Mir's mother, Rosie Elif, joins us now. Rosie, you had concerns about her safety before all this.
Mir contacted me 2 or 3 times in the week leading up to her death, and we spoke on Messenger, and she was telling me about the conditions in the hostel, but particularly about the work she was doing. And she mentioned...
This was farm work, wasn't it?
This was farm work, but it was particularly gruelling farm work. She was working in a cane field. She was picking up rocks and stones, and she had to work really fast. She's 5'5" and slim. You've seen pictures of her. She's a small girl, but she was really determined that she was going to complete her 88 days. Because
Was there any mention of the hostel itself and how that...
She called it, she said it was like a prison camp, and she kept referring to Louisa Carr's book Holes, which she's particularly fond of, and how unpleasant the conditions were in the hostel. She said at one point, she doesn't drink because she's quite allergic to alcohol, and she had a bottle of beer on a shelf in the hostel because she'd been given it at the end of her first shift. She put the bottle there. She was told by the hostel owner that she'd be fined and told to leave the hostel if it was found again. OK, they want an alcohol-free policy, that was fine, but the way she was treated, the way she felt threatened by the atmosphere there.
But you're convinced that what happened and this terrible tragedy of her killing was not an act of Islamic terrorism?
Absolutely.
And why are you so sure? You're somebody, in fact, who has lived in or worked in Islamic countries.
Well, it's not a personal opinion. I spoke to Ray Warida, who is senior in the Queensland Police Force, and he had forensically examined all of Mir's Facebook, and he'd had contact with the French police, and he came to me and sat in this hotel room, and he told me that there was no connection with any Islamic movement, that, you know, he was nominally a Muslim, but apart from anything else, there's nothing in any holy book that would suggest that a man should kill a young girl who he had no connection with, and there was no connection between them.
You've demonstrated extraordinary courage in dealing with this and trying to draw attention to the things which people should be concerned about.
Thank you.
But what a terrible experience to fly all that way, economy class and the rest of it, and just thinking about this and then flying back and arriving back here yesterday.
I can't claim to have done the whole flight economy class, but however, It was terrible, and it was, you know, I've had very little sleep, but what's seen me through is, one, the most incredible friendships that Mia formed out there, and the wonderful girls and boys who I met, who Mia had formed really strong bonds with. They crowdfunded her funeral, they crowdfunded the event after it, and we formed really strong bonds, and they're going to come and visit me here.
Rosie.
On top of that, sorry.
No, but sadly, time has caught up with us, but thank you so much for coming and having the courage to talk about it.
Thank you.
Back tomorrow at 7, but for now, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.